Sometimes when you read history, you come across terms which you don't really understand, but you read it for the sake of reading. These are terms which occur across the history textbooks, and they are a little separate from the narratives of history, from the facts of history that you are told, like which battle was fought when. So, for example, when you talk about historians, what is the difference between a contemporary historian and a later historian? What do these terms even mean in their essence? I'm going to talk all of that because I feel that history is not as technical as economics, but understanding these terms does lead to a better understanding and a better conception of history that you're reading. And it does help you in higher levels of history if you do want to pursue history later on in your life. We are introduced to such terms in our high school, perhaps inter, but we're not really told sometimes. I feel there is a dearth of information of these technical aspects, but and that is what I'm here to talk about today. So, what is a contemporary historian? A contemporary historian is a person who writes about the history that he or she is experiencing of their own time. For example, I live in the 1700s. I write about whatever I'm experiencing about my own time. So for me, it is present, but 100 years down the line, it's going to be history. And so I will be known as a contemporary historian who wrote during the time that it actually happened. Say I wrote a book of history of my polity, of my economy, of my society that I experienced in 1700s. Now, 100 years down the line, another fellow picks up my book and reads that, oh, 100 years ago, this used to be the society, the polity, the economy. And so then he reads my books as a reference, and then he writes his own history. He becomes a later historian. बाद में आया वो. उसने मेरी किताबें पढ़ी, he read my books, and then he wrote his own history. Another 100 years down the line, so that was 1800s now. Another 100 years down the line, in 1900s, a third fellow who reads the history of 1700s will say, the original writer was a contemporary historian because they experienced the history from their own eyes. For them, it was the present. For the later historian, they read it with some referencing other historians. They also are a historian of equal merit. They might have added on to some historical development or a narrative development that, completes my history. And so from reading in, for example, 2023, I read Barani when he writes Tarikh-e-Feroz Shahi. Tarikh-e-Feroz Shahi becomes a collection of both works because he was living during the times of Feroz Shah Tughlaq. That was his contemporary. He's a contemporary historian of Feroz Shah Tughlaq. But all the history that he has constructed before Feroz Shah Tughlaq, he has referenced works. So he becomes a later historian of that time period, but he becomes a contemporary historian for Feroz Shah Tughlaq's era. These are rather simple, nuanced differences that many teachers of history assume that children already know because, well, English is not our first language. Sometimes we don't understand them, and sometimes the teachers do take it for granted that, okay, itna to bacche ko pata hoga. They should know this much. And so when you read at a graduation level, they would assume that you know the political histories already, so they'll teach you economic and social history. When you read at a post-graduation level, they would assume you know political, economic, and social history. They would teach you nuances of history, like gender history. So it's a progressive, in-depth study of history, and therefore it's important for you to clear these constructive elements of study of history right at the ground, at the very basic of your study. If you're in class 6, 7, 8, perhaps in your 10th or 12th, and you have started referencing historians, which you don't really do, but if you have started, then this is the major difference between historians. There are two major types, contemporary and later, and this was the difference between them.